So I'm back. I know, I know. You thought maybe I'd finally done it, finally gone full contractor and just ghosted on a project and left you with a half finished podcast and a hole in your Tuesday commute where content used to be. No, I didn't ghost you. I was just out there doing what contractors do when the phone stops ringing. I was making the phone ring again. But we'll get to that. Today, we're talking about Project Hail Mary, the movie, the book it came from, the leadership lessons buried inside a story about a man who wakes up alone in space with no memory, no crew, and no idea what planet he's even from, let alone what he's supposed to be doing 60 trillion miles from it. And here's the thing that got me. That scenario, being airdropped into a project with zero context, no documentation, no team, and a scope of work that you have to reverse engineer from the wreckage around you. I've had that Tuesday. A lot of us have. The difference is Ryland Grace had the decency to be unconscious for the bad part. We're going to break down the leadership and project management skills of every major character in this film, and we're going to tie it to both of my books. I know, I said both, and you're going, but Mark, you only have one book, the Hard Knock School of Project Management, available at leadershipknocks.com and on Amazon. And that's true for the moment, but I've been working on a new one. We're going to talk about that briefly in a little bit. But to come back around, Andy Weir is the Jules Verne of our generation. Boom, there I said it. And you can quote me on that. And the dude accidentally wrote the most thorough case study in the history of the Hard Knock School of Project Management. And I think he deserves to know that. But before we jump into any of that, I need to catch you up on where I've been, talk about something that happened last week that I can't just skip over, and tell you what was happening in the world the day this movie opened. But one more thing before the music drops. Spoilers, all of them. Every single one. I'm not protecting the plot of this movie for you. If you haven't seen it, go see it. Read the book, then come back, and we'll be here waiting for you. If you haven't seen it and you don't care, well, you're welcome. Stay here, man. Door's open. But if you're the kind of person who's going to pause this in 40 minutes and send me a direct message that says, you ruined this for me, I'm telling you right now, I gave you fair warning, and I feel no remorse. All right, let's go to school.
Rocky hate Mark.
Oh, hi, Mark. So why specifically project management and leadership?
Because that's what the book is about.
Why is the book about that?
It's a made-up tale.
The 7 sacred lessons from the School of Hard Knocks.
This one was invented by a writer.
I learned the hard way. Actually, it was a good learning experience.
It's a total fabrication. It never happened.
It's the Hard Knock University podcast, where real talk meets real lessons. We all graduate with honors in the School of Life.
Wretched, isn't it?
So here's the thing about this podcast. You can use it as a barometer for how well things are going with me financially. When the episodes are coming out regularly, things are good. When there's a 6-month gap, I was out there in the dirt trying to make something happen. And it's not a complaint. That's just the deal that I made when I decided to do this. Hard Knock University is somewhat of a hobby project. It's not the bread and butter. It's not where I make all of my money. I don't make any money off of this. I only recently got monetized on YouTube, have yet to get monetized on any of the audio platforms. And it's all subsidized, all of it. This whole thing, the podcast, the books, the Substack, all of it is part of this ecosystem that is subsidized by Mark Dalton Homes and Doors by Dalton. And when that ecosystem is healthy, you get content. When the ecosystem needs triage, you get silence, and then all of a sudden an episode about a movie where a man has to improvise his way through an impossible project with no resources and no backup plan. And I am aware of the irony. I assure you, it's not lost on me. The last 6 months have been rough. I'm not going to dress that up. The construction market in all of the United States has been doing what it does when the economy is playing whack-a-mole with interest rates for 2 years straight. And that means that the phone wasn't ringing the way it needs to ring. And so I went to work trying to get the phones to ring. But Mark Dalton Homes is still building. Doors by Dalton is still installing doors. And I picked up some new audiobook narration work. because it turns out if you have a voice and a microphone and a willingness to sit in a quiet room reading other people's words into a recording device for hours at a time, people will pay you for that. Who knew? I did. I knew. And that's why I did it. I've also been writing. The next leadership book, Anti-Hero Leadership, is coming along. It's a good book, and it's about it's harvested directly from this podcast. All of this work that we've been doing on breaking down all these villains, I'm putting that into pages, and I'm creating this book about the villains that we become when nobody's watching, and the 3 archetypes that tend to show up when leaders operate from their worst instincts instead of their best ones. We're going to talk a lot about that today because, as it turns out, Project Hail Mary is a case study in all 3 of those archetypes and what happens when they collide with a man who refused to be any of them. And I've been working on a fiction novel, science fiction specifically, a story about institutional failure and human stubbornness set somewhere other than Texas, which is a first for me. Very much in the style of Andy Weir, which again, I promise was a coincidence, and which again, I do not fully believe, but that's where I'd been. Out there working, building things, writing things, narrating things that other people built and wrote. There's a line in Project Hail Mary that I keep coming back to. Ryland Grace is describing his situation, and he says, essentially, I have no crew, no memory, no plan, and I don't have enough fuel to get home. But he goes to work anyway, because, what's the alternative? And that's been my last 6 months. One-way mission, improvising the fuel source as I go. Now, before we get into the movie, there's something I have to talk about first, because it happened last week, and I'm not built for pretending things didn't happen. Last week, my daughter survived a school shooting. She's okay. She's not even injured. I want to say that first, and I want to say it clearly because I know some of you just felt your stomach drop, and I don't want you sitting there feeling that pain longer than you need to. She's okay. She's home. She's safe. I'm less okay, but that's parenthood, and that's a different conversation. I debated whether to talk about this on the podcast, spent about 4 minutes debating it, which tells you everything you need to know about where I landed. This show is called Hard Knock University. The whole premise is that you learn the real stuff from the real things that happen to you, not from a textbook, not from a certification program, not from a guy in a polo shirt at a conference who's never poured a foundation in his life. If I skip over the hardest thing that happened to me this week because it makes for uncomfortable listening, then I've broken the deal I made with you on episode 1. So here we are. My daughter survived a school shooting last week. And I want to talk about it the way I talk about everything on this show, not as a victim, and not as a political statement, as a project manager looking at a specific project that has been failing for decades in plain sight with no accountability and no owner. And somehow that's just the world that we live in now, because it is what it is. That's every time this happens, and it happens so often that I'm embarrassed to say out loud how normalized it has become in my brain. The same play runs. The left gets on television and talks about guns. The right gets on television and talks about mental health. And here's my honest assessment after standing in the place where this is no longer abstract to me. They're both right. And I know that's not a satisfying thing to say. I know that the algorithm wants me to pick a side and say that the other side is evil and give you something to share, but they're both right. Guns are part of the problem. Mental health infrastructure in this country is a catastrophic failure. Both of those things are true at the same time, and neither one of them is a complete answer by itself. And here's where they're both wrong. Neither side has ever actually treated the patient. What they've done instead is use this issue to raise money and to mobilize their base. They've used it to draw a contrast with the other side at election time. And then nothing moves, nothing happens, nothing changes. The bills die in committee, or the study gets defunded, or the agency gets gutted, or the politician gets primaried and starts over from zero. As a project manager, I have a specific word for that situation. Leadership failure. Not a policy disagreement, not a difference of values, a leadership failure. The kind where the project has been clearly defined, the resources exist, the expertise exists, the urgency is documented in the most brutal possible terms, and yet there is no answer. Nobody is accountable for the outcome. The project just sits there bleeding while the steering committee argues about who's responsible for the scope, and nobody pulls the trigger on a solution. In construction, if I hand you a project with a known structural defect and you hold 3 meetings about it and you commission 2 studies about it and you give a speech about it at the ribbon cutting and then the building falls the fuck down, I don't call that a tragedy. I call it negligence. We have watched the building fall down how many times now? And we keep commissioning the study. We keep giving the speech. The buildings keep falling down. My daughter was in that building last week. I don't have a clean ending for this segment. I'm not going to give you a hashtag or a call to action because, frankly, I don't trust any of the institutions I'd be sending you toward. What I will say is this. There's a theme running through everything we're going to talk about today. It's about what happens when people in charge stop protecting their position long enough to actually solve the problem they were put in charge of solving. We're going to see that in the movie. We're going to see the opposite of it in the institutions that failed my daughter's school. All right, I've said my piece. Now let's talk about what was happening in the world on March 20th, 2026, the day that Project Hail Mary opened in theaters. Okay, March 20th, 2026, first day of spring. First day Project Hail Mary was in theaters. Let's set the scene. The movie opened on a Friday, which means it opened into the full chaos of the first round of March Madness. Because of course it did. The NCAA tournament first round was Thursday and Friday of that week, with the second round on the weekend, which means half the country was watching basketball and the other half was watching Ryan Gosling wake up confused in outer space. And honestly, both groups were dealing with a man who had no idea what was happening and had to figure it out in real time. For the record, the tournament ended with Michigan winning the national championship over UConn, 69-63 at Lucas Oil Stadium in Indianapolis. On the women's side, UCLA made history, winning the program's first ever national championship, beating South Carolina 79-51. And on opening day of the tournament, Texas Longhorns were in the first round getting ready to do something nobody expected. They came in as an 11 seed, having barely survived the first 4, and they went on a run that took them all the way to the Sweet 16 by upsetting Gonzaga 74-68 in the second round in San Antonio on the weekend this movie opened. I don't know if that's relevant, but I'm from Texas, so I'm mentioning it. On the music charts, the number 1 song in America the week of March 21st was Choosin' Texas by Ella Langley, co-written by Miranda Lambert. It's a country song with a classic feel. It had already been number 1 multiple times, kept getting knocked off by Taylor Swift and Bad Bunny and Bruno Mars, and kept coming back, which, if you're looking for a metaphor about resilience and refusing to stay down, Ella Langley is right there for you, and she did it in boots. On television, the number 1 scripted drama on broadcast was CBS's Marshals, a Yellowstone universe spinoff that pulled nearly 9.5 million viewers at its premiere. The number 1 comedy was Georgie and Mandy's First Marriage, also on CBS. CBS is really just kind of running television, which makes what I'm about to tell you about the other big TV news of that week even more interesting. Because the same week Project Hail Mary opened in theaters, Paramount announced that Star Trek Starfleet Academy was being canceled. Now, I want to spend a minute on this because it matters to this show and it matters to this episode. Starfleet Academy appeared on Paramount Plus in January of 2026. The season 1 finale aired on March 12th. 11 days later, Paramount canceled it. The second season was already filmed, already in post-production. The cast and crew had finished the work, wrapped principal photography, and were waiting on a release date, and Paramount pulled the plug anyway. The reason, according to people who track these things closely, was viewership. Reports out of the industry suggested the entire first season, not per episode, the whole season combined, pulled around 400,000 views, average of 40,000 views per episode, on a major streaming platform for one of the most iconic science fiction franchises in the history of television. 40,000 people per episode. But here's the thing. They canceled it. I mean, I don't even know if that last episode had aired yet when they decided to cancel it. And the thing is, a lot of people, a huge chunk of people wait until the whole thing has been released and binge it. So, you don't have all the data in yet, Paramount. And you're just pulling the plug on Not just Star Trek, Starfleet Academy, but all of Star Trek. I'm horrified. The result of that cancellation is that for the first time since 2017, there are no new Star Trek shows or movies currently in active production. 2 film seasons of Strange New Worlds are still in post and haven't aired yet, so there's content coming, but nothing is shooting. Nobody is on a soundstage right now making Star Trek. The franchise that launched a streaming renaissance on Paramount Plus with Discovery back in 2017 is now dark. That's 9 years of building a television universe, and it ended not with a finale, not with a send-off, but with a spreadsheet and a phone call and a show that ends on a cliffhanger that will never be resolved. And I want to be careful here because I have opinions about the creative direction of the Kurtzman era of Star Trek, and I could spend 2 hours on them, and this is not that episode. What I will say from a pure leadership and project management perspective is this. Paramount built something. They invested in it for nearly a decade. And then the metrics came back soft on one show. And instead of diagnosing the problem, instead of asking why a show with an 87% critic score on Rotten Tomatoes was pulling 40,000 viewers per episode, instead of examining whether the platform itself had a discovery problem or a marketing problem or a subscriber problem, they canceled the show 11 days after the finale and turned off the lights. No plan for what comes next. No owner accountable for the outcome. No meaningful strategy for the franchise going forward. They threw a Hail Mary 9 years ago and it worked. And then instead of building on what they caught, they just stood there in the end zone holding the ball until someone turned off the stadium lights. That's a leadership failure. We've had a theme today. Now, let's talk about the movie itself. Let's talk about a scientist who woke up with no memory, no crew, and no plan in a situation so far beyond the scope of any reasonable project character that most PMs would have just gone back to sleep. And let's talk about what he did instead. All right, per our usual procedure, we're going to work through the IMDb synopsis of Project Hail Mary beat by beat, the way I usually do it. I'm going to read you a section. We're going to talk about it. And by the time we're done, you're going to have a graduate level education in leadership and project management that you didn't pay $120,000 for. You're welcome. Here we go. Ryland Grace awakens from an induced coma on an interstellar spacecraft. Initially erratic with retrograde amnesia, Grace discovers that he is the sole survivor of the 3-person crew on board and that he is light years away from Earth in a distant solar system. Let's stop right there. I want you to think about the worst project handoff you've ever experienced. Maybe the previous PM quit without notice. Maybe they got fired and escorted out of the building. I don't know. Maybe you showed up Monday morning and found a sticky note that said, "Good luck," and a job site that looked like a controlled demolition that someone forgot to control. Whatever that moment was for you, I want you to hold it in your mind. Now I want you to multiply it by the distance between here and the nearest star. Ryland Grace wakes up not knowing his own name. He doesn't even know what planet he's from. He doesn't know what he's doing in a spacecraft. He doesn't know his crew is dead. He has to reverse engineer the entire project from the physical environment around him, one clue at a time, using nothing but the scientific instincts he apparently still has, even though he can't remember acquiring them. In my first book, The Hard Knock School of Project Management, lesson 2 is called "You'll Rarely Have All the Answers." And the point of that lesson isn't that ignorance is acceptable. The point is that expecting yourself or anyone else to have all the answers is not just unrealistic, it's actively harmful to the project. It creates burnout. It creates bad decisions made from pride instead of information. It creates a culture where nobody asks questions because the PM is supposed to be the keeper of all knowledge. Grace doesn't have that. Grace has the opposite problem. Grace has no knowledge at all. And here's what's interesting about watching him work. He doesn't panic about what he doesn't know. He catalogs it. He makes a list of what he can observe, what he can test, what he can verify, and he operates from evidence instead of assumption. He treats ignorance as data. That's a skill. And it's one of the hardest skills to build in project management because the pressure to perform, to walk into a room and act like you have it handled is enormous. But Grace has nobody to perform for. He's alone. So he just does the work. Meanwhile, He's also the chaos junkie of the anti-hero leadership framework. No plan, no memory, no structure, running on instinct. The interesting question at this stage of the story isn't why he's chaotic, it's what it takes to self-organize when there's literally nobody to organize you. Okay, so Grace slowly remembers that he is an American middle school science teacher and former molecular biologist. In the past, scientists observed the sun dimming and the formation of an infrared line from the sun to Venus called the Petrova line. The dimming, caused by a microorganism known as an astrophage, exponentially increasing its population on the sun's surface, will result in a catastrophic global cooling of the Earth within 30 years. Government agent Eva Stratt recruits Grace and other scientists around the world to study the astrophages. Okay, so now we have the project. The sun is dying, not metaphorically, not as a business analogy. The actual sun is literally dimming. 30 years to catastrophic global cooling. 6.5 billion people on a clock that most of them don't even know is running. And the response, at least initially, is to form an international coalition of scientists and government agencies to study the problem. I want you to sit with that for a second. The sun is dying, and we formed a committee. In lesson 4 of the Hard Knock School of Project Management, we talk about managing people and not tasks. And I describe a project where the stakeholders included my boss, his boss, the board, investors, a realtor, a church pastor holding power of attorney for an elderly homeowner who only spoke Spanish, and a rotating cast of trade partners who wanted nothing to do with any of them. And I said that managing that mix was like conducting an orchestra where half the musicians were out of tune. The international coalition trying to address the astrophage crisis before Stratt shows up is that orchestra, multiplied by the number of governments on Earth. Every one of them playing a different song, every one of them protecting their own interests, every one of them convinced that their particular instrument is the most important one in the entire ensemble. And this is what happens when a project with global stakes and a hard deadline gets handed to a structure that was designed for consensus, not outcomes. Consensus is great for deciding where to have the company holiday party. It is a catastrophic management model when the building is on fire. Enter Eva Stratt. Stratt is handed emergency authority, the kind where she can conscript scientists, commandeer resources from sovereign nations, and make unilateral decisions that would end any normal administrator's career. And she uses that authority without apology, without consultation, and without the slightest visible concern for how it lands. In the anti-hero leadership framework, Stratt is the most complicated character in this story because she operates with the tools of the fear-based leader, the micromanager, the Voldemort, the one who demands compliance through power and consequences. But her motivation isn't ego. It isn't self-preservation. It isn't the protection of her own position. Her motivation is the sun. She doesn't care about her legacy. She doesn't care if you like her. She cares that the project gets done before 30 years runs out and the oceans freeze. That's real leadership. That's a real leadership question. And it's one I want you to sit with. Do you know the difference between someone who demands compliance because they're afraid of losing power and someone who demands compliance because the building is on fire? Because the behavior looks the same from the outside. The meetings feel the same. The decisions feel unilateral and uncomfortable either way. The difference is what's underneath. Stratt has nothing underneath it but the mission. Most fear-based leaders have nothing underneath but themselves and their egos. And that distinction is everything. And this story is going to keep testing it. Moving along. Grace discovers that an astrophage is a single-celled organism impenetrable to any form of electromagnetic radiation, and that it breeds on Venus through the planet's carbon dioxide and energy from the sun. Astrophages have infected other stars within Earth's solar neighborhood, and researchers also find them to be a very effective, if not volatile, fuel source. Stratt discloses Project Hail Mary, an international effort to send a crew on a suicide mission to Tau Ceti, the only undimmed nearby star. The Hail Mary spacecraft only has enough astrophages as fuel for a one-way trip, but will carry probes to send the crew's findings back to Earth. Okay, so we're on a one-way trip, and I've said before on the show that you can tell a lot about the health of a project by looking at the exit strategy. A well-run project has a clear definition of done, a transition plan, and a path to closeout. A poorly run project just sort of keeps going. Scope creep, change orders, nobody willing to call substantial completion because calling it means being accountable for what got built. Project Hail Mary has no exit strategy by design. The mission is so far beyond the reach of conventional project planning that the planners didn't even bother pretending there was a way home. They built a spacecraft with enough fuel to get there and probes to send the data back, and that's the whole plan. You go, you find out why that star isn't dimming, and you send what you learned back to Earth, and then whatever happens to you next is beyond you and the universe, and what happens with that data when it gets back to Earth is also up in the air. And even if the data makes it back, nobody knows. It's a Hail Mary by its very definition. It's the perfect title. God damn you, Andy Weir, you're a fucking genius. From a pure project management standpoint, this is very clarifying. When there's no exit strategy, there's no hedging. There's no keeping one eye on the door. The mission is the mission, complete and total, and the only variable is whether you execute it or you don't. In lesson 7 of the Hard Knock School of Project Management, the best plans will still fall apart, I talk about a renovation project where the budget went from $202,000 to $609,000, and the timeline went from 18 weeks to 18 months. Hidden fire damage, a water line cracked from one end to the other, permit delays stacked on top of permit delays. Every plan we had fell apart, and we built a new one, and that one fell apart, and we built another one. The lesson isn't that planning is useless. The lesson is that the plan is a starting point, not a guarantee. And your job isn't to execute the original plan necessarily. Your job is to execute the mission. The Old House Reborn didn't get finished because we were following the plan. It got finished because we kept building new plans until one of them worked. And Grace is about to learn that lesson at a scale that makes an 18-month residential renovation look like a weekend project. Back to the plot. In the present, as Grace approaches Tau Ceti, he sees an alien spacecraft. The spacecraft, which docks with Hail Mary, is made of a substance Grace calls xenonite. The pilot of the other ship is a rock-like, 5-legged alien from 40 Eridani, whom Grace names Rocky. Grace deduces that Eridians see via echolocation and creates a machine translation system for Rocky's musical speech, basically duct taping together some laptops and running some translation software and assigning it a voice. It's pretty clever and cute. And this is where the movie earns its money. You want to talk about an unexpected subcontractor showing up in your job site? Rocky's the gold standard. Grace is approaching a star 60 trillion miles from Earth completely alone, and a spacecraft shows up, made of solid xenon, a gas. And it's piloted by a 5-legged rock creature that communicates through musical tones and navigates by echolocation. The project just changed. Now, there are 2 ways to respond when an unexpected resource shows up on your project. You can treat it as a threat, or you can treat it as an asset. Now, most project managers operating under stress and under pressure with a mission with high stakes like this and this personal, choose threat. They get territorial. They protect their scope. They decide the unexpected thing is a problem to be managed rather than an opportunity to be leveraged. Grace chooses asset almost immediately. But here's the thing I want to focus on, because this is where lesson 6 from the Hard Knock School of Project Management lives. And it's the lesson I think gets the least attention in project management conversations. You're a translator for everyone and everything. I wrote that chapter because of a project I managed for a family where every member was hearing impaired. No verbal communication. I'm standing in the same room as the homeowners, and we're conducting our entire relationship through text messages on our phones, looking up at each other between messages like we're in the world's most polite standoff. And somehow the project got done on time, under budget, because I adapted my communication method to fit the people I was communicating with instead of expecting them to adapt to me. Grace doesn't have a shared language with Rocky. He doesn't have a shared biology, a shared atmosphere, a shared sensory experience, or a shared evolutionary history. But what he has is a problem they both need to solve and a willingness to build the bridge from scratch. So he builds a translation machine. Think about that from a project management standpoint. Before Grace and Rocky can even begin to work together, before they can share a single piece of data, before they can coordinate a single task, Grace has to invent the communication infrastructure. He has to build the tool that makes collaboration possible. In my book, I talk about the PM as a universal translator, borrowing the metaphor from Star Trek, which in retrospect feels appropriate given everything we discussed in the last segment. But the idea is that your job isn't just to manage tasks. It's to ensure that every person involved in the project is working from the same understanding of what the project is, what success looks like, and what their role is in getting us there. You translate between the client and the contractor, between the engineer and the homeowner, between the person who knows what it needs to do and the person who knows how to build it. Grace translates between human and Iridian. That's lesson 6 taken to its logical extreme. And it works for the same reasons it works on a residential job site, because communication isn't a nice to have. It's the foundation the whole project is built on. Without it, two capable people with the same goal are just two strangers standing next to each other in the dark. Moving along in our synopsis, Rocky explains that he is a mechanic and also the sole survivor of a mission to stop the astrophage. Neither can survive in the other's atmosphere, so Rocky enters Hail Mary using a small pressurized ball as a spacesuit. So Rocky is a mechanic, not a scientist, not a commander, not a project lead, a mechanic. The Iridian equivalent of the trade partner who shows up on your job site, does what he does better than anyone you've ever seen, and doesn't say a word about it because the work speaks for itself. And I want to point something out here that I think gets overlooked in how people talk about this story. Rocky is not the hero. He's not trying to be the hero. He's not protecting his credit or his legacy or his position. He's a mechanic who got sent on a mission, survived when nobody else did, showed up at Tau Ceti with the same problem Grace has, and got to work. That is the control variable in the anti-hero leadership framework. I write about 3 archetypes in anti-hero leadership. The overplanner, who hides behind process and preparation to avoid making actual decisions. The chaos junkie, who mistakes motion for progress and can't function without a crisis to react to. And the fear-based micromanager, who controls everything because they don't trust anyone, including themselves sometimes. Rocky is none of those things. Rocky is what you get when you subtract the ego from the equation entirely. No archetype, just a mechanic who knows what he knows and gets to work. I want you to think about the people on your team who are like Rocky. The ones who don't talk about what they're doing. They just do it. The ones who don't lobby for recognition. They just solve the problem in front of them. The ones who, if you got a message from them at 2 a.m, you'd know that it was serious. Those people are the whole project. Not the PM, not the client, not the stakeholder with the corner office and the opinion about the paint color. The Rockies, the mechanics, the ones who show up in a pressurized ball because the atmosphere is incompatible and there's work to be done. Treat them accordingly. Getting back to our synopsis. In the past, Grace meets Hail Mary's commander, engineer, and scientist and their backups. While handling some astrophages, an accident kills the scientists, and the backup crew 3 days before launch. With no time to train a replacement, Stratt asks Grace to take the place of the deceased scientists. When Grace refuses, Stratt has him drugged and forcibly put on Hail Mary. And there it is. The moment where Eva Stratt goes from complicated to genuinely difficult to defend. Grace says no. He doesn't want to go. He's a middle school science teacher who got pulled into the project against his better judgment, and when he's asked to give his actual life for it, he declines. And that's a reasonable human response. That's what most of us would do. But Stratt drugs him and puts him on the ship. In lesson 3 of the Hard Knocks School of Project Management, Sometimes You're the Bad Guy, I talk about the moments in project management where you have to deliver news nobody wants to hear, make calls nobody wants you to make, and accept the fact that you're going to be the villain in someone else's story for doing it. I talk about changing out a trade partner against the wishes of the stakeholders because the work wasn't getting done. I also talk about telling a client that their project scope has to be condensed down because they just don't have the budget for it and there's no magic available. I talk about using verbal judo and never split the difference to have those conversations with empathy and clarity and without blowing up the relationship. Stratt doesn't use verbal judo. Stratt uses a syringe. And here's the thing I've been sitting with since I saw this movie. She was right. Not ethically. Ethically, what she did is indefensible. You can't kidnap a civilian and conscript them into a suicide mission, regardless of the stakes. That's not a gray area. It's just wrong. But from a project management standpoint, Grace was the only person on the planet that could do what needed to be done. The mission was 3 days from launch. The scientist was dead. The backup scientist was dead. And that was a huge mistake in the first place. They knew that the astrophage was dangerous. And I mean, that's the whole reason that they were out on boats messing with the stuff in the first place. At some point, they stop messing around on boats, start messing around on shore, put both the scientist and the backup scientist in the same room together to work with some explosive ass shit. The quartermaster can't read the directions correctly, and or not the directions, but the recipe. I don't know. He's supposed to give him a little bit, and he gives him more, and kaboom! Huge problem with implementing the plan there. Which, I mean, all things considered, the fact that that's the only thing that went wrong before the launch happened, and Grace wakes up and 2 of the crew members are dead. That's a thing that went wrong, but this explosion that kills the scientists is the first big thing that goes wrong. That is that's a failure in implementing the plan right there. But we move on. The important thing is that there's no time to train anyone new because there's only 3 days to go. And even if there had been, nobody new had what Grace had. So Stratt looked at the situation and made the calculation that the mission was worth more than Grace's consent. That is the most extreme version of being the bad guy and making the bad guy call that I have ever seen in a story. And the reason it works dramatically is because Andy Weir earns both sides of it. Stratt isn't wrong about the stakes, and Grace isn't wrong about his rights. And the movie and the book don't resolve that tension. It just lives in it and lets you sit with the discomfort, which is exactly what good leadership writing should do. Bravo. Because here's the real question underneath everything, and it's a question I want you to take back to your own work. When you make the bad guy call, what are you protecting? Stratt is protecting the mission, not her career, not her reputation, not her relationship with Grace. The mission, the 30-year clock, the 6.5 billion people who don't know the clock is running. Most bad guy calls aren't protecting anything that big. Most of them are protecting the project. Some of them are protecting the client. Some of them, if we're being honest, are protecting the project manager's own comfort level or their need to feel in control. Sometimes they're just protecting egos. The call is only worth the cost if what you're protecting is worth protecting. You got to know what you're protecting before you make that call. Getting back to the plot. Following Tau Ceti's Petrova line, Grace and Rocky find that the planet Tau Ceti E, which they name Adrian after Rocky's mate, harbors an organism that preys on astrophages, controlling their population. So the solution already existed. They didn't invent it. They didn't engineer it. They followed the evidence, trusted the process, and found something that was already out there doing the work. I love this beat more than almost anything else in the story because it's the most honest thing in any project management narrative out there. I mean, in lesson 2 of the Hard Knock School of Project Management, I tell you about Frank Hambone, the painter who showed up on one of my jobs with a handheld color matching scanner that synced to his phone and found the closest Sherwin-Williams match in 30 seconds. And I had been doing color matching the old way for over a decade, cutting out pieces of a wall and driving to the paint store, then driving back and repairing the hole. Frank walked in and made that entire process obsolete in under a minute. I didn't know the tool existed, not because I wasn't paying attention, but because I was so locked into the way that I'd always done it that I wasn't looking for a better way. The solution was already out there. Grace and Rocky don't cure the astrophage. They find the Tau amoeba, an organism that already does it. It already exists. It already works. Their job was to get to Tau Ceti, follow the evidence, and recognize the answer when they found it. That's it. That's the whole mission. My job on that color match project wasn't to invent a better way to match paint. My job was to hire Frank Hambone and get out of his way. Know what you're building. Know what you're finding. Those are 2 different projects with 2 different success metrics, and confusing one for the other is how you end up reinventing things that already work while the actual problem sits there waiting for a solution. Back to the synopsis. After learning that Grace cannot return home, Rocky offers enough astrophages to refuel Hail Mary. While gathering the organism from the upper atmosphere of Adrian, a fuel leak causes an uncontrollable spin that renders Grace unconscious. Rocky breaks his spacesuit and saves Grace, but is severely injured. So Rocky breaks his suit, and Rocky's suit is not just equipment. Rocky's suit is his life support, his atmosphere, his survival. He has an entirely different, he doesn't breathe oxygen like we breathe. He breathes like argon or something. I forget. And then he exists in a temperature way, way, way hotter than our temperature. So he can't survive in our atmosphere long. It'll kill him just as us trying to be in his atmosphere will kill us. That suit is the only thing standing between him and an environment that will literally kill him. Breaking his suit to save Grace is not a calculated risk. It's a deliberate choice to put his own survival in second position behind the survival of his partner on this project. In lesson 5 of the Hard Knock School of Project Management, Success Often Goes Unnoticed, I write about the invisible work of project management. The stuff that never shows up in the final walkthrough, the 3 a.m. phone calls, the change orders you absorbed without billing because the relationship mattered more than the profit margin. The times you stood between the client and a problem and nobody ever knew the problem existed because you handled it before it got to them. Rocky's act is the ultimate version of that invisible work. Nobody's watching. Nobody's keeping score. There's no camera, no audience, no after-action review where his sacrifice gets documented and recognized. There's just Grace, unconscious, drifting, and Rocky calculating that the math is simple even if the act is not. In lesson 4, Managing People, Not Tasks, I tell the story of the Old House Reborn. When the structural crisis hit mid-project, I called an all-hands meeting, not to assign blame and not to revise the schedule, but to solve the problem together as a team. And the reason it worked is because by that point in the project, every person on that team knew they were in it together, that the job wasn't just a paycheck, that I had their back the way they had the project's back. Rocky breaks his suit because by this point in the story, he and Grace are in it together, not contractually, not professionally, actually in it together, the way you only get when two people have been solving hard problems in close quarters for long enough that the professional relationship becomes something that doesn't have a clean category. That's what gets built by great teams, not necessarily deliverables. That thing. And here's the anti-hero leadership mirror that I want to hold up. Think about each of your three villain archetypes in this moment. The overplanner runs the calculation. Rocky's atmosphere is incompatible. Saving Grace introduces unacceptable risk to the primary asset. The mission comes first. Grace is a variable, not the constant. The overplanner lets him drift and writes a very thorough report about why it was the correct decision. The chaos junkie panics, makes 3 decisions in 4 seconds, 2 of which contradict each other, breaks the suit, realizes immediately that was wrong, tries to fix it, makes it worse, and somehow Grace and Rocky both survive anyway because the chaos junkie has the universe's most improbable luck. Then you have the fear-based micromanager who freezes because this is a decision with no precedent, no protocol, no documented procedure. And making a decision without a protocol means being personally accountable for the outcome. And being personally accountable for the outcome is the thing the fear-based leader will do anything to avoid. But Rocky does none of those things. Rocky looks at Grace, looks at his suit, and makes the only choice that the person he has become through this partnership could make. The leader you are under pressure is the leader you actually are. Getting back to our synopsis. While Rocky recovers in hibernation, Grace finds a way to breed the astrophage-consuming organism, which he names Tau-amoeba. Rocky revives, and he and Grace part as friends to their home planets. They solved it. Done. 2 people, no committee, no steering group, no executive sponsor sending encouraging emails from a corner office 60 trillion miles away. Just 2 people, 1 problem, 1 shared language they built from scratch, and enough trust in each other to break a spacesuit when the moment required it. I want to contrast this explicitly with the Earth-side operation because the contrast is the lesson. Earth throws the full weight of global civilization at this problem. Every government, every resource, international coalitions, emergency authorities, the conscription of the world's best scientific minds, and they get close. They get a ship in the air with a crew and a mission and probes to send the data home, and then they have to wait. Grace and Rocky strip the problem down to its skeleton. 2 people, a shared goal, a communication system they invented because nothing else existed. There's no politics, no ego, no one protecting their budget or their legacy or their relationship with the board, just the problem and the 2 organisms willing to solve it. In lesson 4, I write that the best teams aren't built from the best processes. They're built from people who understand that the task is never really the task. The task is always the relationship that makes the task possible. Grace and Rocky don't have a contract. They don't have a scope of work. They don't have deliverables and milestones, a Gantt chart projected on a conference room wall. They have a problem. They have a deadline, and they have each other, and they get it done. That's the cleanest project management lesson in this entire story. Not the spacecraft, not the astrophage, not the Tau-amoeba. The fact that 2 people who couldn't breathe the same air, couldn't touch each other, couldn't share the same physical space, built the most effective project team in the history of 2 civilizations by deciding that the communication gap was a problem to be solved rather than an obstacle to hide behind. Okay, getting back to our synopsis. During the trip to Earth, Grace discovers that the Tau-amoeba have evolved the ability to pass through their xenonite containers and are eating Hail Mary's astrophage fuel. Grace fixes the problem on his ship, but realizes that Rocky's entire ship is made of xenonite, allowing the Tau-amoeba to consume all of his fuel. Left with the choice of returning to Earth or saving Rocky and his home world, Grace chooses the latter, sending the Tau amoeba and his research to Earth via the probes. So the project is done. The deliverable has been sent. The probes are carrying everything Earth needs. So from a pure project management standpoint, Grace's obligations are complete. The contract, such as it is, has been fulfilled. He can go home, but he stays. In lesson 7 of the Hard Knock School of Project Management, the best plans will still fall apart. I write that success in any project isn't about preventing the plan from failing. It's about how you rebuild when it does. The Tau amoeba evolving to eat xenonite isn't a failure. It's just another curveball, another change order from the universe, another moment where the plan you had is no longer the plan you need. Grace doesn't panic. He fixes his own ship. Then he does the math on Rocky's ship, and he understands immediately what this all means. And then he makes a values-based decision underneath the project management decision. I asked you earlier to hold on to the question of what you're protecting when you make the bad guy call. And this is the answer in its most complete form. Grace isn't protecting himself. He isn't protecting his career, his legacy, or his relationship with Earth, or his chance to see his daughter or his friends, his life again. He didn't have a daughter, but just saying, if it was me. He's protecting his partner, the mechanic who broke his suit at 60 trillion miles from anywhere because Grace's life was in danger. And now I want to run the archetypes one final time, because this is where the anti-hero leadership framework earns its keep. The overplanner goes home. The scope's complete. The deliverable is sent. There is no project item for save the alien civilization. The overplanner writes a very thorough debrief about the difficult but ultimately correct decision to prioritize mission completion over personal relationships. Chaos Junkie probably stays, but for the wrong reasons. Not out of loyalty, but out of the inability to tolerate the absence of a crisis. The moment the immediate emergency is resolved, the Chaos Junkie needs a new one. And Rocky's situation is right there. The fear-based micromanager goes home. Going home is safe. Going home is defensible. Going home lets you write the report and control the narrative. Staying means accepting an outcome you cannot manage, cannot control, and cannot take credit for. Staying means giving everything to a result that will happen or not happen without you watching. Grace stays. Not because the project requires it, but because the person he became on this project requires it. Because you don't abandon the mechanic who broke his suit for you just because the scope of work says you're done. That right there is the leadership lesson. Not the heroism, not the sacrifice or the clarity. Grace knows exactly what he's protecting, and he doesn't hesitate for a second. Back to our synopsis, the probes deliver to Stratt what humanity needs to kill the astrophages. The Iridians create a biodome on their planet for Grace to live in. Rocky tells them that the Iridian scientists have finished preparing Hail Mary to return to Earth. While contemplating the news, Grace begins another day of teaching science to Iridian children. He's teaching. He was always teaching. That's who he was before Stratt showed up. That's who he was when she made the choice for him. That's who he was when he woke up on the ship with no memory. It was always in there. The mission didn't build it. The mission just cleared away everything that was sitting on top of it. In the epilogue of the Hard Knock School of Project Management, I write that the path to mastery is paved with the stones of adversity. That the hard knocks aren't the obstacles to becoming who you're supposed to be. They're the process. They're the curriculum. Grace is the guy that taught middle school science and cared more about whether his students understood than whether he got credit for the lesson. That person, that teacher, was there the whole time. The crisis just kind of turned up the heat. And that's true of every great project manager I've ever known. The ones who are genuinely good at this, not good at performing at it, not good at talking about it, but good at the actual work, they were good at it before the crisis hit. The crisis just revealed it. And the ones who fall apart under pressure, The overplanners and the chaos junkies and the fear-based micromanagers, they were those things before the crisis too. The crisis just turned up the heat. So the question I want to leave you with before we get to the ratings is not who you are when the project is running smoothly. It's not who you are when the phone is ringing and the invoices are going out and the client is happy and the schedule is green. The question is, who are you when the tau amoeba evolve? When the plan falls apart in a way that nobody planned for? When the only choice that makes sense is the one that costs you something real? That's who you actually are. Everything else is just space debris. All right, time to grade the paper. This is the part of the show where I rate the leadership and project management skills for whatever it was that we just watched. In this case, Project Hail Mary, on a scale of 1 to 10. 1 being my first year running a remodeling company, which was essentially a masterclass in how not to do anything, and 10 being the theoretical perfect project that has never existed and never will, but gives us something to aim at. We've got 3 characters worth grading individually today. Let's start with Eva Stratt. For project management, I want to give her a 9 out of 10. As a project manager, Stratt is extraordinary, and I resent it slightly because she achieves it through methods that would get the rest of us arrested. She inherits a global crisis being mismanaged by a committee of sovereign governments, all protecting their own interests, and she converts it into a functioning mission with a clear scope, a defined deliverable, a launch day, and a crew in 18 months, while conscripting scientists from multiple countries and commandeering resources from people who very much did not want to give them to her. The scope is clear, the timeline is real, the deliverable: send a crew to Tau Ceti, find out why it's not dimming, and get the data back to Earth. It's specific and it's measurable. She builds the team, sources the fuel, designs the spacecraft, and gets the thing off the ground in a time frame that would make NASA cry. I give her a 9 because the model doesn't scale. You can't build a project management practice on emergency authority and a willingness to drug the people who say no. The minute Stratt's method gets replicated by someone with worse judgment and smaller stakes, it becomes a horror story instead of a case study. On leadership, I'm going to give her a 6 out of 10. And it's not an insult. The 6 is an honest assessment of what Stratt's leadership costs. She gets things done. Nobody questions that. But the way she gets things done treats human beings as variables in a project plan rather than stakeholders with rights and agency. She doesn't build trust. She doesn't develop her team. She doesn't create an environment where people feel safe to contribute their best thinking. She creates an environment where people do what she says because the alternative is unclear and probably unpleasant. That works exactly once under exactly those conditions with exactly this level of existential stakes. It is not replicable. It is not teachable. And frankly, a leader who can only function when the world is literally ending is not a leader you want running your organization when the world is not ending, which is most of the time. 6 out of 10. She's a tremendous project manager and a complicated human being, but do not attempt to replicate her management style at home. Ryland Grace, project management, 9 out of 10. Grace earns his 9 the hard way. He doesn't start as a good project manager. He starts as a man with no memory, no crew, no plan, and a scope of work he has to reverse engineer from the environment around him. The fact that he ends up executing one of the most successful missions in the history of 2 civilizations is entirely a function of how he responds to conditions he didn't choose and couldn't control. What earns the 9 is the consistency of his method. He catalogs what he doesn't know instead of just, running with it with unearned confidence. He builds the communication infrastructure before he attempts the collaboration. He adapts every time the plan falls apart without ever losing sight of what the mission actually is. And the Tau Amoeba pivot recognizing the new problem, solving it on his own ship, and then immediately running the math on Rocky's ship and understanding what it means. That's the clearest illustration of lesson 7 from the Hard Knock School of Project Management that I have ever seen in a piece of fiction. The best plans will still fall apart. The job is not to protect the plan. The job is to protect the mission. Grace never confuses those two things, not once. 9 out of 10. Extraordinary PM. Started as a chaos junkie and evolved into something the framework doesn't have a clean category for, which is maybe the best possible outcome. Leadership, 9 out of 10. Grace's leadership arc is the spine of the whole story. He goes from a man who was physically put on a spacecraft against his will to a man who voluntarily stays 60 trillion miles from home because his partner needs him. That is not a small distance to travel, and I'm not talking about the astronomical unit. What makes him a 9 and not a 10 is the front half of the story. Grace spends considerable time and energy trying not to be the leader this mission needs. He's passive where Stratt needs him to be decisive. He's reluctant where the mission needs him to be committed. And he's performing the role rather than inhabiting it right up until the moment he can't afford to anymore. But here's the thing about that. The back half earns the front half, because when Grace finally steps fully into the mission, when he stops hedging and starts owning, it's not because someone promoted him or gave him a title or told him he was ready. It's because the situation required it and he was the only one there. That's how most real leaders find their footing. Not in a boardroom, not in a certification program. In the moment when the plan falls apart and there's nobody else to rebuild it. 9 out of 10. Reluctant, and then extraordinary, which in my experience is exactly how the best ones usually go. All right, now Rocky. Project management, 8 out of 10. Rocky is a mechanic, not a project manager. And I want to respect that distinction because I think it matters. His 8 isn't a criticism. It's an acknowledgement that Rocky isn't trying to run the project. Rocky is trying to solve the problem, and he is extraordinarily good at solving the problem. What keeps Rocky from earning a 9 in project management is that he operates almost entirely in the present tense. He's reactive in the best possible way, responsive, adaptive, inventive. But the longer range strategic thinking, the planning across multiple contingencies, the building of systems that outlast the immediate crisis, that's kind of Grace's side of the partnership. Rocky builds what needs to be built right now. Grace figures out what needs to exist 6 steps from now. And together, they're at 10. Individually, Rocky's an 8, which is great. Competence puts him ahead of roughly 90% of the project managers I've ever worked with or alongside. So let's not lose perspective. 8 out of 10. Best subcontractor in the history of 2 solar systems. Would absolutely hire. Would make sure the atmosphere situation was sorted out first, but I would absolutely hire him. Now, on leadership, I'm going to give Rocky a 10 out of 10. Rocky gets the only 10 I have given on this show, and I want to explain why, because I think it's important. Rocky doesn't get the 10 because he's the most skilled. He's not. Grace is arguably more versatile. Stratt is arguably more effective at the macro level. Rocky gets the 10 because he is the only character in this story who operates with zero gap between who he is and what he does. There is no archetype under Rocky, no shadow, no ego protecting itself, no fear driving the decisions from underneath the surface. He is a mechanic who got sent on a mission. He solved the problems in front of him. He built a friendship across a gap so wide it shouldn't have been possible. And when Grace needed him to break his suit, he broke his suit. Not after a calculation, not after a committee meeting, not after consulting the project charter to see if suit breaking was in the scope. He just did it because that's who he is. I've spent a lot of this episode talking about the anti-hero archetypes, the overplanner, the chaos junkie, the fear-based micromanager. These are the shadows that we carry into our work and the ways they undermine the projects and the people that we're responsible for. Rocky is what you get when you do the work to clear all of that out. When the ego isn't running the show, when the fear isn't driving the bus, when the need for control and credit and recognition has been stripped away, and all that's left is competence and commitment and the willingness to break your suit when the moment requires it. Rocky gets a 10 out of 10. The gold standard. All right, let's bring this home. I want to go back to the beginning. Not the beginning of the movie, the beginning of today. I told you at the beginning that a Hail Mary is what you throw when you've run out of good options. The last play, a desperate heave from midfield with no time on the clock and no reason to believe that it's actually going to work. In football, it almost never does. The name exists because the only thing left to do when you throw it is pray. And that's how most people think about the Hail Mary, as a failure state, as the thing that you do when everything else has already gone wrong. And I want to offer you a different frame. The Hail Mary isn't a failure state, it's a clarity state. When you strip out every option except the one that matters, something interesting happens. You stop debating, you stop hedging, you stop protecting your position and managing your exposure and running the political calculation on who's going to be unhappy with the decision. All of that falls away because there's no time for it and no point to it. There's just the mission and the clock and the arm and the ball. Grace woke up on that ship with nothing. No memory, no crew, no plan, no margin. And because he had nothing to protect, he was free to do the only thing worth doing. He got to work. That's the gift the Hail Mary gives you if you're willing to receive it. It clears the field. It removes the noise. It takes all the things you've been using to avoid the actual problem and throws them out the airlock, and suddenly you can see the problem clearly for the first time. And you can see what needs to happen, and you can see who you need to be to make it happen. The crisis doesn't build the character. It just removes everything that was hiding it. Now, I started today talking about my daughter, about what happened last week, about the institutions that were supposed to protect her and didn't, and the leaders who are supposed to own that outcome and won't. And I want to come back to that. This country has been throwing the same Hail Mary on school safety for 30 years. And I mean that in the worst possible sense of the phrase, not the clarity state version, the failure state version, the desperate, unplanned, nobody owns the outcome version, the version where you throw the ball because you ran out of time and you never bothered to build a real offense. The left throws the gun control Hail Mary. The right throws the mental health Hail Mary. The ball hits the turf. The clock runs out. The press conference happens. The moment of silence happens. The check goes to the super PAC. And 3 months later, somebody else's kid is in somebody else's school, and we run the same fucking play again. It's not a Hail Mary. It's a punt dressed up as a Hail Mary. A punt with better lighting and a more emotional press relief. The difference between Ryland Grace and every politician who has held a microphone in front of a school in the last 30 years is not courage, it's not intelligence, it's not even resources, it's ownership. Grace accepted the mission fully without a backup plan or an exit strategy or a committee to share the blame with if it didn't work. He accepted it so completely that when the mission was technically over and he could have gone home, he stayed because ownership doesn't end when the deliverable ships. Ownership ends when the thing you were protecting is actually safe. Nobody in this country has accepted the mission on this issue. Not really at all, not fully. Everybody's just punting. They've accepted the press opportunity. They've accepted the campaign contribution. They've accepted the committee assignment and the subcommittee chairmanship and think piece in the publication that their donors read, but they have not accepted the mission. Because accepting the mission means being accountable for the outcome. And being accountable for the outcome is the thing the fear-based leader will do absolutely anything to avoid. I said early in this episode that accountability without ownership is just noise. 30 fucking years of noise. My daughter sat in that building last week. She came home. And that's the thing. Not every kid comes home. And the people whose job it is to own that outcome are still out there protecting their position, running the same play, watching the ball hit the turf and calling it a Hail Mary. It's not a Hail Mary. It's a failure of leadership so complete and so sustained that we have collectively stopped being surprised by it, which might be the most damning thing I've said on this show. I don't have a clean solution for you. I'm a contractor from San Antonio who builds houses and reads books and thinks too hard about leadership on a podcast that not very many people even listen to in the first place. I'm not the guy with the answer. But I know what the answer looks like when it's working. I've seen it. Grace and Rocky, two people from different worlds who couldn't breathe the same air, built it in the middle of the most impossible project in the history of two civilizations. They built it out of communication and trust and the willingness to break the suit when the moment required it. It starts with someone fully accepting the mission, without the exit ramp. We're still waiting on that someone. We need someone to accept the fucking mission. And I get the irony that Grace didn't actually accept the mission. He was forced into it. But fuck, how many kids have to fucking die before somebody accepts the mission? Until then, I'll be here, building things, writing things, putting out episodes when the ecosystem lets me, and grinding when it doesn't. Raising my daughter who survived something she shouldn't have had to survive. And trying to be the kind of leader in my own house and in my own businesses and my own little corner of the world that I'm asking everyone else to be in there. And that might be my biggest flaw, is that I expect everybody else to be decent human beings. And apparently that's a tall order. I don't understand why. I don't, but it is. But that's all any of us can do. Show up, own the outcome, break the suit when it's time. When are we going to get that Republican or that Democrat or that independent who breaks the suit, reaches across the aisle, works with everybody, and comes up with real solutions? Who is our Rocky? And if that plan falls apart, build a new one, you know? It always falls apart eventually. The job is, what do you do next? Your hashtag HardKnockLesson. Success in any project isn't about preventing the plan from failing. It's about how you rebuild when it does. I'm Dalton Caples. Words of encouragement.
Can't you say words of encouragement?
Words of great encouragement. Don't